By 1945, the country Mussolini ruled with absolute fear for decades had turned into his cage. The myth of the Roman Empire lay in ruins. Why could the German divisions no longer save him? Their last wall had crumbled. April 18th, the Argenta Gap. Allied heavy artillery shattered the silence of the marshlands. British and American tanks surged through the breach. They didn't just break a line, they punctured a lung. The Gothic Line was a massive system of steel and concrete. Forced labor spent years carving it into the mountains. It fell in days. Now Allied armor poured into the flat expanse of the Po Valley. The scale of the collapse was total. Allied engines roared across the plains, their decibels drowning out the desperate radioed commands of the Wehrmacht. One moment, there was a front. The next, only a vacuum. Sherman tanks kicked up dust as they raced toward the heart of the North. German units abandoned their heavy gear. They traded positions for retreat. British and American columns advanced without stopping. While Allied tanks tore through the Po Valley, Mussolini sought sanctuary in the church. On April 25th, he entered the Archbishop's palace in Milan. He came to meet Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster. The dictator was looking for a bridge. He found a wall. Schuster had spent months playing the middleman. Now his role was simple: delivery of an ultimatum. Representatives from the Committee of National Liberation waited in the same building. They did not come to talk. They came to dictate. The mechanism of diplomacy was broken. Mussolini's plan for a negotiated surrender collapsed against a single, rigid phrase: unconditional. To the resistance, there were no terms. There were no guarantees of safety. The partisans demanded total submission. The halls of the palace fell into a cold silence. The committee made the stakes clear. Unconditional surrender meant immediate arrest. And in the streets of Milan, arrest was a synonym for an execution squad. Mussolini listened to the terms. He realized the cardinal could no longer protect him. He walked out of the palace into a city he no longer owned. No political maneuvers remained. No loyal army existed to shield him. The Committee of National Liberation officially called for a general uprising that same afternoon. Mussolini had no path left. Cardinal Schuster's diplomacy proved useless against 200,000 armed Italians rising across the north. The era of grand balconies was over. Mussolini was 61 years old. He was sick, exhausted, and fading. Since September 1943, he had governed from small towns around Lake Garda. The Italian Social Republic existed on paper. In reality, it was a German cage. Who actually controlled the streets of northern Italy? It was no longer the fascists. The dictator sat in lakeside villas while German commanders made every military decision. His authority had shriveled to a symbol. Outside his window, the social fabric was tearing apart. What started as small underground cells had mutated into a massive, irregular army. 200,000 partisans now held the mountains. This force exceeded the standing armies of several European nations. The sound of dynamite echoed through the valleys. Partisans shattered rail lines. They cut mountain supply routes. Fascist officials were hunted in their own offices. Total social control had vanished. Expectation: a leader of a sovereign nation. Reality: a prisoner of a fiction sustained only by German bayonets. The collapse accelerated on April 21st. Bologna fell. It was the vital transport lung of the region. Its capture opened the veins of the Po Valley to Allied armor. German units retreated in disorder. By April 24th, Genoa and Turin were in open revolt. The industrial heart of the north followed. Milan prepared for a general armed uprising. Spain was the last hope. For the crumbling fascist elite, General Franco offered more than sympathy. He offered a sanctuary. This Spanish connection would later evolve into the rat lines, the secret escape routes for those fleeing the ruins of Europe. The illusion of power vanished on the evening of April 25th. Mussolini abandoned Milan. He claimed to be relocating government offices. In reality, the dictator was running. He needed the Swiss border. He needed Lake Como. The plan was a desperate gamble. Cross into Switzerland, seek asylum, then negotiate a flight to Spain. It was a thin straw for a man who once ruled an empire. Darkness swallowed the road to the north. Mussolini was not alone in the car. Beside him sat Clara Petacci. She was 33 years old. Since 1936, her life had been tethered to the Duce. Her family had thrived under the regime. Her father, Francesco Petacci, rose to prominence as a high-ranking physician in Rome. He understood the price of their privilege. By 1945, that price was due. Clara had chances to flee. Earlier in the war, there were plans to send her to Spain. She refused. As the convoy prepared to leave Milan, she insisted on her place in the back seat. It was a choice confirmed by those who watched the cars pull away. The escape was a family affair. Her brother, Marcello Petacci, followed in the line of vehicles. He aimed to protect what remained of their interests and secure his own exit. He was one of many in a convoy of dozens of cars. Mussolini exchanged his tailored uniform for the rough texture of a German Luftwaffe greatcoat. He pulled a steel helmet low over his eyes. The man who once demanded the gaze of millions now craved invisibility. To save his life, the Duce became a nameless passenger in the back of a muddy truck. 30 vehicles crawled north through the winding roads of Lake Como. This was no triumphal motorcade, it was a retreat. 200 German soldiers from anti-aircraft units provided the only shield left for the falling dictator. 30 cars and 200 foreign soldiers. This was all that remained of his Mediterranean empire. The Luftwaffe flak troops were in a state of panic themselves. Their only goal was reaching the Reich, and their protection was an illusion. Mussolini sat in silence. He avoided every eye contact. At each checkpoint, he felt the heavy fabric of the German wool against his skin. He was no longer a leader, but a piece of human cargo trying to reach the Swiss border. But the roads were no longer his. Partisan units of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade had already severed the arteries of the north. They waited at every bend, watching for the high-ranking fascists they knew would flee this way. Armed patrols stood ready at the partisan checkpoints. How does a 20-year dictatorship end? Not with an epic battle, but with a routine check on a rural road. On the afternoon of April 27, 1945, a German convoy crawled along the western shore of Lake Como. It reached Dongo, a quiet lakeside town. Mountains on one side, water on the other. History usually bypassed this place. Not today. The 52nd Garibaldi Brigade blocked the narrow road. Their leader, Pier Luigi Bellini della Stella, stood his ground. The German officer in charge lied. He claimed the trucks held only retreating Wehrmacht soldiers. No Italians, no politicians. The partisans didn't believe him. They demanded a full inspection of every vehicle. The air in the truck beds thickens. It smells of exhaust fumes and the damp, heavy wool of German greatcoats. Partisan Urban Lazaro climbs into one of the transports. He scans the rows of tired men. One figure sits hunched in the corner. He wears a German Luftwaffe overcoat. A steel helmet is pulled low, hiding his face. He stares at the floor, avoiding every gaze. Lazaro steps closer. He reaches out. He yanks the disguise away. The face underneath is unmistakable. 20 years of total control ended here. Not in a reinforced bunker, but during a document check by village militiamen. The great dictator looked like a common smuggler. He was shivering. Beside him, they found Clara Petacci and her brother Marcello. The high-ranking fascists tried to maintain their dignity, but their faces betrayed them. Some froze, others trembled. The partisans pulled Mussolini from the truck. They stripped him of the stolen German uniform. They isolated him from the soldiers who could no longer protect him. By early evening, the most wanted man in Italy was officially a prisoner of the resistance. Local fighters took the dictator into custody and cut him off from the retreating Germans. While the prisoner sat under guard in a remote village, the Committee of National Liberation for Northern Italy met in Milan. They faced a choice between a trial and a firing squad. The Allies demanded a formal tribunal. They wanted a second Nuremberg on Italian soil, but the committee saw the reality on the streets. Northern Italy was a powder keg. German units remained armed. Communication with the high command was broken. The committee represented everyone: communists, socialists, liberals, and Christian Democrats. They had already ordered a general uprising on April 25th. Now they feared the crowd. If the dictator stayed alive, the city would burn. Justice was no longer about law, it was about trauma. In August 1944, the regime had publicly executed 15 partisans at Piazzale Loreto. Their bodies were left in the heat as a warning. 15 dead men. The memory of that square dictated the sentence. The masters of a fallen empire spent their final night hiding in the corners of peasant houses. From the heights of Roman balconies to the claustrophobia of a village bedroom, the contrast was total. Mussolini and Clara Petacci did not sleep. Outside, the night of April 27th was a blur of shadows and paranoia. Guards whispered in the hallways. Metal keys scraped against rusted locks. Every few hours, the captives were moved. From one stone building to another, across dark alleys. The victors were terrified. Why did armed partisans tremble in the middle of their own territory? They feared the ghosts of the Wehrmacht. German truck engines echoed in the Alpine passes. One radio leak, one stray word, and a Nazi commando raid could turn the village of Dongo into a slaughterhouse. The prisoners were not alone in their fear. Alessandro Pavellini, the secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, sat in the dark. He was the regime's most loyal shadow. Beside him was Nicola Bombacci, a man who had once been a close comrade of Vladimir Lenin. He had traded the Bolshevik Revolution for the blackshirts. Now, he was just a prisoner in a farmhouse. This ideological wreckage sat together in the silence. The architects of a 20-year dictatorship waited for the sun to rise. No speeches, no anthems, only the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Walter Audisio arrived from Milan on the morning of April 28, 1945. He carried a mandate from the Committee of National Liberation. It replaced any court. No lawyers, no formal defense, no long legal process. Audisio, known as Colonel Valerio, held the authority of a revolution in his hands. The partisan machine moved with cold efficiency. By 3 in the afternoon, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were in a vehicle heading south along Lake Como. The drive was short. The setting was unremarkable. The car stopped in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. There was no scaffold, no shouting crowds, only the narrow asphalt of Via 24th Maggio and the rusted entrance of Villa Belmonte. Mussolini stepped out. He was pale. His body looked heavy and drained. Gravel crunched under their boots as they walked toward the stone wall. The dictator did not run. He did not argue. He simply stood there, staring at the gray stones of a provincial villa. Valerio ordered Clara to step aside. She was not on the execution list. No committee had debated her fate. She looked at the man she had followed to the edge of the abyss and refused to move. A trophy Moss 38 submachine gun, stripped from a dead soldier. This was the tool of partisan justice. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the execution at the villa gates nearly collapsed into a technical failure. Walter Audisio forced the pair against the stone. He raised his weapon. He pulled the trigger. A dry metallic click. The bolt jammed in the absolute silence of the hillside. For several seconds, the colonel fumbled with the mechanism. High-stakes theater turned into clumsy desperation. A second weapon, the French Moss 38, was shoved into his hands. This time, the firing pin struck. Mussolini took the first burst in the chest. He collapsed instantly. Clara Petacci fell beside him, caught in the same spray of lead. It was over in seconds. No last words, no dignity, just the smell of cordite and the sight of 2 bodies cooling against a garden wall. Why did 15 more officials have to die by the lake shortly after? It was the cold mathematics of vengeance. Months earlier, the fascists had publicly executed 15 partisans at Piazzale Loreto. Now, the debt was being collected in full. Firing squads at the Dongo lakeside worked like a conveyor belt. No charges were read. No defense was permitted. High-ranking ministers and loyalists were lined up and shot in rapid succession. By evening, 15 high-ranking fascists lay dead on the stones of the square, 80 kilometers in the darkness. over broken roads toward thousands of hungry people. The truck moved south through the night of April 28th, carrying 15 corpses and the end of an era. The war was still breathing, but the partisans had a destination. The convoy reached Milan in the early hours of April 29, 1945. They stopped at Piazzale Loreto. Why did the crowd snap at this specific square? The answer lay in the fresh scars of the pavement. Months earlier, fascists had executed 15 partisans on this exact spot, leaving them to rot as a warning. Now, the math of vengeance was complete. By dawn, the word spread. The city emptied into the square. These were people who had lived in cellars since 1942, hiding from Allied bombs that leveled their blocks for 2 straight years. They were starving. They were broken. The truck gates opened. The bodies hit the dirt. The explosion was not political. It was biological. The crowd surged forward. A boot crushed a rib. A fist struck a dead face. Someone spat, then another. They weren't attacking a leader anymore. They were erasing a nightmare. A woman fired 5 shots into Mussolini's remains, 5 bullets for her 5 dead sons. The corpses of the Duce and Clara Petacci were dragged through the mud, becoming unrecognizable masses of gray flesh and torn cloth. The frenzy had no center. It was a collective therapy of violence. Partisans realized the ground was no longer enough. They needed a stage. They dragged the bodies to the edge of the square, toward the skeletal remains of a bombed-out Esso service station. The metal beams groaned under the weight. Men looped heavy ropes around the ankles of the dead. Slowly, the partisans hauled the lines taut, hoisting the bodies high above the reaching hands. Mussolini, Petacci, and the others dangled upside down from the girder of the Esso station. Adolf Hitler killed himself on April 30, 1945. It was the only way to escape the rope. The news from Milan had already descended into the concrete silence of the Berlin bunker. Above, the world was in flames. Below, the Führer sat in the Reich Chancellery, listening to the crackle of a radio receiver. The broadcast carried reports from the Allied side. It detailed the carnage at Piazzale Loreto. Hitler had known Mussolini personally for years. He watched the Duce rise. Now he heard how the Italians had finished him. No trial, no dignity, just a mob and a meat hook. The contrast was absolute. Outside, thousands of voices in Milan screamed with uncurbed rage. Deep underground, the leader of the Reich sat in total silence, making his final choice out of pure terror. He refused to become a trophy. He saw the images of the hanging bodies in his mind and understood the message. If he stayed alive, the same display awaited him on a German square. While Hitler burned his bridges in Berlin, the image of his fallen ally was already feeding the printing presses across the Atlantic. Local photographers in Milan scrambled into makeshift darkrooms. They worked in the heat of field laboratories. The sharp, acidic stench of developing chemicals filled the air. Silver halide reacted. Grainy shapes emerged from the fluid. Why did global newspapers publish these brutal frames? To strip the dictator of his aura of invincibility before the eyes of millions. In the 19th century, a defeated Napoleon went into exile. The 20th century demanded a different receipt. Modern society required a visual autopsy of power. The press provided it. Reporters followed Allied boots through northern Italy. They didn't see a battlefield, they saw a commodity. The process was mechanical. Film rolls moved from leather bags to chemical tanks. Prints were dried and rushed to couriers. Within days, the scene from the industrial square reached the United States, Britain, and France. The contrast was absolute. For years, the world saw the man on the Palazzo Venezia balcony, chin up, chest out, a monument of Roman iron. Now, readers in New York and London saw a different shape, a body dangling from a girder at a gas station. No dignity, no ceremony, no state funeral. The myth of the Caesar died on the front pages of the morning editions. The spectacle he built had finally consumed him. The cameras had already done their work. While newspapers in France and the United States turned the page, the physical remains continued to poison Italian society. The state faced a paradox. A dead dictator is often more dangerous than a living one. How do you hide a corpse from an entire nation? you strip it of a name. On May 2, 1945, officials buried the body in the Musocco Cemetery in Milan. There was no ceremony, no headstone, just an unmarked plot of earth. The government gambled on oblivion. They lost. The silence lasted less than a year. In the early hours of April 23, 1946, shadows moved across the graveyard. Domenico Lacisi, a young neo-fascist, led a small group to the site. They dug. They found the wooden crate. They stole the body. For months, the dead Duce moved like a ghost across northern Italy. Police raided villas and searched trunks. In August, they found the remains hidden in a monastery. The state realized that even a skeleton could spark a revolution. To prevent a neo-fascist shrine, they locked the remains away for more than a decade. The political deadlock broke in 1957. Prime Minister Oddone Zoli needed right-wing support to maintain his cabinet. The price was the body. The government finally allowed the transfer to Predapio, the dictator's birthplace. Mussolini was placed in the family crypt, ending 12 years of wandering. The era of the living myth was over. The era of the stone monument began in 1957.